Over the years, as I've done these podcasts, I found it really interesting to compare in your face at the coalface counterterrorism with other forms of counterterrorism. And that's kind of what I want to explore today. Hi, I'm Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Ontario, Canada. You're listening to Canadian Intelligence 8. When we talk about counterterrorism, we really mean a whole bunch of different things. It's a very generic term. You've probably heard the term CVE, or countering violent extremism as well. This is this notion that kind of radicalization of violence is sort of a spectrum. It is a process that people go through, and there's various points at which you can intervene to stop people from, well, let's face it, doing bad things, building bombs, shooting people, taking a butcher knife and cutting people's throats, et cetera, et cetera. I thought it'd be really interesting, and I believe this is probably the first time I've had us on the podcast, to talk to someone who's really done counterterrorism at the absolute sharpest end of the blade. This is actually going in and doing raids against people who would rather, kill you than look at you, kind of thing. And so I'm really, really pleased to have on the podcast today Shane Healey. Shane Healey enlisted in the Australian Army way back in 1995. He also worked as a private military contractor in Iraq between 04 and 08. Was deployed, he reenlisted in the Australian Army, redeployed twice to Afghanistan in 2010, 2011, and 2012 as part of Task Force 66, where he provided insurgent threat assessments. He's got a ton of experience when it comes to that sort of edge of the knife kind of counterterrorism. And he's joining me on the line from Neutral Bay, which I've just learned is on the north side of the iconic Sydney Harbour Bridge. So Shane, thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast.
Thank you for the introduction.
So I've given a little bit of background, Shane, on your what you did with the Australian Army in counterterrorism, whether it was as a private contractor in Iraq or Afghanistan. Can you walk my listeners through, many of whom would have no idea what it means to be in the military and doing counterterrorism? What was it like doing those operations in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I have actually got to see the full spectrum of, I guess, tier one counterterrorism, the evolution of it. When I first started observing and then getting involved in it in Iraq in 2004, it was still a lot of lessons learned from those that would have seen the Black Hawk Down movie.
Right.
And they were still learning. And if you've seen some of the podcasts, especially from some of the American former JSOC guys, they'll tell you that even in those first years, the evolution of their TTPs and equipment was just at a staggering rate, to how it's essentially got into a flow state by 2009-10 in both Afghanistan and Iraq. So, you could hit multiple targets. The fusion between intelligence and operations had really matured I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar with the F3 EAD cycle that started.
Walk us through it.
Find, fix, finish. So you find, intelligence finds a target, intelligence fixes a target, then an action arm will usually finish. Now, that could be anything from kinetic operations to capture to psychological operations. And I've got some really funny examples of that. And then coming back to exploit what you found on target. That could be an interview with a captured detainee, to SSE, so sensitive site exploitation, so any phones or anything on target, to then looking at your analysis to dissemination, the AD. So, and then that's a cycle. It just, who did you lift? Who's going to replace him? Is it the guy you're after? What's the next link in the chain? And because it's that cycle, it's never ending. You never get, you might have got Osama bin Laden, but who's taken over? You didn't get Zawahiri, for example. So, but that process over that time just became so much fluid that, it was just another day at the office.
I like how you mentioned, Shane, about how it never is over. And you've probably come across this term. It's quite well known as the so-called decapitation theory of terrorism, which means you take out the head guy and basically the rest of the body kind of withers away. In this notion that you've got a very strong leader, very charismatic, very hands-on, and if you eliminate him, there's no one left in the zoo to actually run it. And I have found historically that's rarely, if ever, true. Would you agree with that? That when you take out the bin Laden, like you said, you don't get the Zawahiri. Although between you and me, Shane, Ayman al Zawahiri has got the personality of drying paint when you compare him to UBL. But was that your experience that even if you did take out a fairly senior figure, that it wasn't just you can wipe your hands, go on to the next one. Like it actually, you had to keep following up to see, as you said, who's second in the line. Is he more effective? Has he learned a lot? Does the group become more dangerous with him in charge? Was that your experience when you were working in Iraq and Afghanistan?
So, and that this goes to the evolution of the target set. So, when I first got to Iraq and the internet was very new, 100%, because um, there wasn't that log on connection. There wasn't that I'm sitting in a basement, or I can get my word across to millions of people globally at the touch of a button. A lot of it was having to go to preach and people listening and getting them encouraged that way. So if you took the voice out, um,
Hmm.
a lot of that message did dissipate. Then as
Hmm.
the internet got more popular, it was, Al Alki is a great example. You can still find his
Exactly.
sermons online, but
Yeah.
pre the internet, he would have been no one.
Hmm.
So the evolution of the internet has made that theory of cutting the head off the snake almost redundant, for a number of reasons. You look at the magazines, Debate, Ramallah, Inspire.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
you know, uh, they're there. Doesn't matter if the writer or the message is gone. Those magazines, that ideology is
Mm.
still online. So I think,
I've still got piles of magazines in my office. I've got when I was still working for the security service, I collected Inspire, kind of like, you used to collect comic books as a kid. I
yeah,
collected Inspire and Dabiq, and you're right, they're out there. And I'm glad you raised Olaki. When I talked to Brig Barker a couple of weeks ago, ex FBI guy, I mean, Olaki was everywhere. I'm not sure if it's the case in Australia for ASIO, but for us at CSIS, every target we're looking at, Aulaki was on not on speed dial, but all of his lectures, all of his material
yeah.
was
Same.
available, and these guys just they saved it all.
Yeah, they would, and you can still it's still online if you Google it. They would get him to essentially Skype in to do sermons into
Yeah.
some of the mosques in Sydney, and we also had, prior to the Sydney Olympics, we had Abu Bakar Bashir from Indonesia, the Jamaat
Yes.
Islamiyah leader. He used to
Yes.
come out to Sydney and preach quite
Mm.
regularly, to be honest. There was a prior to ASIO cleaning Sydney up before the Olympics, there was a fairly strong Jamaat Islamiyah presence in Sydney. And again, that's all
Yes.
Google. If you Google that, that's not speaking out of school about that one either. But just not many people know about it because I haven't been in the space since, I didn't have grey hair and I had a lot more hair on top of my head when I started. So, um,
Makes two of us, my friend.
but the interesting thing was when I went across from quote unquote shooter an intelligence analyst. My first trip to Afghanistan, our intelligence boss basically got us all to read and understand Rudy Giuliani's book Zero Tolerance,
Hmm.
and it's about how he took the mafia down in New York. And prior to that, they could arrest the leader of a mafia family, and he'd just go to a jail, and he'd still run the family out of the jail. So you're not stopping
Exactly.
anything. And it was okay. Well, who's doing? Because the problem we were having in Afghanistan is the leadership for the Taliban was hiding in Quetta, and we weren't cleared hot to operate in Quetta. So we would have to
Mm.
wait who was in our battle space. And prior to
Mm.
2010, no one had really looked at that. Okay, so who and is the most influential people, or what roles? So
Hmm.
by using that theory, we reevaluated the insurgent. operating process, and we looked at the facilitators. It was becoming an IED war. So if we went after IED facilitators and instructors, that's when we could really have the most success. And that's what we did, because they're the ones in the field actually making and planting the bombs. Um,
Right.
and you get that biometrics and exploitation post blast. And one thing the Australian Special Operations did first is they created their own Special Operations engineer unit. So, really upskilled, uptrained search capability, IED capability. And so, therefore, we had the answer to the IED war. Now, it wasn't
Mm.
perfect, but I think if you look at our casualty rate compared to and our success, it was a solution that, to be honest, most of the other Five Eyes have followed suit since then.
Hmm. Well, as you say, Shane, sometimes rocket science is rocket science, right? We hear all the time of people who try to build IEDs, improvise explosive devices, and they fail. They just blow themselves up. So if you can get rid of the top guys that are the best at it, it certainly is going to have an impact on the rest of them because they have to fall to the second tier or the third tier. And at the end of the day, they're actually putting themselves as much risk as they are their targets because the guy that is building it isn't exactly the A team. He's more like the B team or the C team or even the D team kind of thing, right?
Yeah, there's nothing better than getting information of an own goal. Um, that might sound a bit callous, but unfortunately, it's true.
It's
But
true though.
they also, especially in Afghanistan, they weren't very complex. The IEDs, you weren't getting your daisy chains or your EFPs that you were getting
Right.
in Iraq. So you were just getting your ampho, ammonium nitrate type HME, YPOC. They were getting bigger, especially once we started using the Bushmaster um,
Hmm.
vehicle, because they can and are designed to take a fair bang. Um, so you might get two 20-litre yellow palm oil containers, so essentially plastic jugs full of HME stacked on each other with the pressure plate or the charge, and then they looked at the countermeasures we had for their RC devices, and they weren't that sophisticated, but our ECM could counter that. So then they would have kids standing up near the vehicles, and when their phones went dead, they put their hand up so they would judge the distances. So they'd run command wire.
Ah.
So you'd wind up getting a command wire remote controlled IED. So, which in
Okay.
Syria, Jabhat al Nusra really, really took to the next level, to the point where the guy detonating it could be sitting in another country watching the live feed.
Wow.
Yeah, the
Wow.
when I was
That must have
working
been a.
when I was working in that problem set in 2014, counter ISIS stuff, and well, first in Jabhat al Nusra, the Khorasan group, the
Mhm.
advances in their technology was off the chart, especially compared to what we were seeing in 11, 12 in Afghanistan.
So is it constantly a game of catch up then? Is it whack a mole, Shane? When it comes to this, are we? I don't want to ask if we're winning. That's the wrong term. But are we keeping up with the advances? Do we have the necessary people, the necessary knowledge, necessary resources in place to be able to detect these changes in technology and to therefore thwart them, or is it is it more difficult than that?
No, no, we do, and there's I'm trying to work out how to say this. I'm actually on Google looking at something, to be honest. We do, and a lot of that is we they advertise everything like we've discussed through Inspire and open source. So
Hmm.
as an analyst, as you would have been aware too, we're looking for that. And when we would find, what was that big one in Inspire? How to make a bomb in your mum's kitchen. we
Yeah.
would get,
Yeah.
I'd take that
Yeah.
out to our EOD techs, who would then follow the steps. And then
Interesting.
if you get on on Live Leak, there used to be videos on Live Leak in like 2014 of the Khorasan group, literally a step-by-step tuition of how to make an IED. Um,
Wow.
yeah, it was crazy. Um, and then, so what we would do is, one of the things that we did was, it's one thing if you're a skilled, say, engineer, or if you're really used to making IEDs, but how could someone download this video, or get that in Spy magazine, and what kind of basic skill level would they need to do it? So we would get clerks, we would get all sorts of different male and female soldiers with different backgrounds, especially non-engineers, and then
Hmm.
say, right, here's the article, or here's the ingredients, here's $300, off you go. Because the other thing is, can they stay under the detection threshold?
Right.
Can they
Right.
go to your hardware stores and find or buy these items without law enforcement? Because part of the other thing that CSIS, ASIO, and these organisations do is they put certain precursors and certain items on watch lists. And why is that
Hmm.
person buying X amount of whatever? And so, if you look at Anders Breivik,
Exactly.
he spent 2 years making his car bomb, because he knew that
Hmm.
they were monitoring certain amounts of chemicals. So every time he purchased it, he did it in small amounts to stay under that threshold.
I got to share you with this with you, Shane. I've done it in a previous podcast, but one of our biggest investigations was the so-called Toronto 18 back in 05, 06. And they knew exactly what you had said. They knew that certain precursors, certain elements were probably on lists and were being monitored. So they thought they were smart. In actual fact, we had them penetrated by human sources from day one, but that's a whole other podcast. And that's not secret information, that's public information. They had printed up business cards on which they said student farmers. So when they went into fertilizer shops and took 50 kilograms here and 50 kilograms there, they would say, "Well, we're just, we're doing it. We have a farming plot outside of Toronto, and we're growing beans or something, and we need to fertilize our plants." So they thought they were being, they're a bunch of smartasses, right? If we can fool the authorities by pretending that we're actually farmers, not building 3 1-ton bombs. But like as I said, they were definitely monitored up the yin yang. A bit of an unfair turn here, Shane, and feel free to push back. You've done a lot of your career in the Australian military, both the special forces and as a contractor as well. You've been in Afghanistan and Iraq, so you see counterterrorism, the pointy end of the stick, from, I'm going to assume, largely, at least historically, in your time as from a military viewpoint. I, of course, see it more from the security intelligence law enforcement, because that's what my background is, working for the CSIS, so the ASIO equivalent in your country, and dealing with the RCMP, AFP in your country. Do you think, and this is unfair, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think that there should be, how to put this, a lead when it comes to counterterrorism? And should that lead be the military? Should it be security intelligence? Should it be law enforcement? Or is it more, we're all on the same team? We got to figure out how to divide this pie, because the problem is bigger than we can collectively manage anyway. Let's just manage it as best as we can.
So it's an interesting one, especially from Australian perspective, because of the way our national counterterrorism laws operate. My view is pretty strongly the police arrest and the army kill. Um, Problem with that is the police arrest and they don't do CVE very well at all, because they're too busy trying to arrest someone rather than actually turn them around. Then you've also got, as you would have really appreciate this too, um, a lot of really good sharp-end intelligence is at a top secret compartmented level, and it's very
Yeah, yeah,
restrictive
yeah.
who can access that. So again, you've got those niche intelligence agencies through the Five Eyes that have that. and they're normally linked in with the military. We changed ours across from Defence Signals Directorate to the Australian Signals Directorate to change a little bit of that mandate.
Yes.
But again, there's a whole lot of legality behind both sides of that, because who owns the actual information, which you can Google and read a lot about that, keep me out of trouble. But so I think there's no one size fits all, because it comes down to the individual country's legislation, i.e., the US legislation about US military operating on domestic soil and their FBI hostage rescue team. And their tier one special mission units doing the same similar role overseas, compared to an Australian context. Tactical Assault Group East is responsible for any kinetic terrorism operations within Australia. So if you look at
Oh, okay.
so if there's
Okay.
a terrorism incident, that a bit like if you watch, there's a couple of good movies on the Iranian embassy siege, how when the Palestinians went into the embassy, and took it as a stronghold. The police were in charge of the negotiations, but 22 SAS was stood up, and then when they realised that it was going to go kinetic, there was a formal legal handover to the army. They went in and conducted a direct action assault, post assault. Then it gets handed back across to the police for their investigation. We have a same role in Australia, and I
Oh,
believe,
okay. I didn't know that.
yeah, and I believe the public stomach that better, because they expect the army to shoot. That's their job.
Hmm.
Every
Right.
time a police officer in Australian context is involved in a shooting, it's why did he have to shoot? Why couldn't he taser? Why didn't he do this? Why didn't he do
Hmm.
that? Now that's
Right.
very unfair to law enforcement, especially in
Yes.
today's context. I look at some of and I've done a lot of work with our law enforcement and think, fuck, if I was in that bloke shoot, that guy would have been double tapped a long time ago. So there's no
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
I could be a copper. Um, but but it's comes to public perception, and perception is reality, and I think that, and training, the amount of rounds that the tactical assault group assaulters shoot in a day, sometimes 2 days, your state special operation police might do in a couple of months. And if anyone who has operated in that space, it's all about um, reaction skills. It's all about communication. It's all
Yeah.
about timing and
Yeah.
speed and efficiency. And you only get that through training.
I think we're on the same page here, Shane. I've never been a law enforcement officer, even though I did spend some time with the Ontario Provincial Police as a civilian, as a consultant. It really, you know, pisses me off when people say, well, why did they aim for his kneecap? Or why didn't they aim for his
Oh,
ankle? Why did they have to put a shot into the core? Well, that's what they're trained to do. I mean, this isn't like a Calamity Jane with a rifle, Buffalo Bill. I mean, these people are trained to neutralize threats as they face them. And, just saying, well, just wing him to make him wounded.
I
There's
just
far too
throw
many
them.
experts, I think, in the broth there.
Yeah, I just throw them Grossman's Killology and say, "This, read this. It explains it all." I don't have the time to deal with you. I hear
Exactly.
that all the time. Why couldn't they shoot him in the leg? Well, he's on speed and methamphetamine, and he's not going to feel it.
Yeah.
So, you can PCP ice or whatever. You can shoot someone 9, 10 times, and they're not going down. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and
So,
as well as I do, Shane. I mean, if they were to wing him in the leg and then he were to not go down and end up killing a civilian, they said, "Well, why didn't you shoot him in the heart? Like you can't win
exactly
that
right.
game, right? Because you're
Yeah.
damned if you do, damned if you don't."
So I just throw them Grossman's book and go, "He's the expert. Have a read."
Having the fact that you served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm really curious, Shane. If upon reflection, you can walk us through what you think the similarities were, what the differences were, because there's this notion that Iraq was the bad war and Afghanistan was the good war. No war is good, really, when it comes down to that. What were the lessons that you took out of the kinetic operations you were involved with in those two conflicts? Were they much more similar than they were different, or was there, given the problems of the intelligence that was cooked to go into Iraq versus Afghanistan, so there's all the complicating factors there as well. But from your perspective, and having been in both places, was it more of the same, or was it really? And I know there's going to be a time factor here too. You talked about the evolution of IED building, for example. So it's hard to compare what happened in '04 versus, let's say, what happened in 2012 from that perspective. But were these conflicts very similar in nature in terms of what the end goal was, or were they very different?
Uh, the end goal in any conflict when you're fighting a Sunni Salafi extremist group, Al Qaeda, Islamic State, the Taliban, that ideology. So from that point, no, they got similar goals. Iraq was much more harder because of the urban environments involved. Um,
Hmm.
the funding behind both groups, the training. So, for example, in Iraq, 80% of your Sunni insurgents were ex-Republican Guard, including their leaders and
Yes.
officer corps. You know, from the 19, from the early Al Qaeda in Iraq and 1920 Brigade and those organisations out in the Al-Anbar province, they were your hardcore former Republican Guard guys. And then down in the south were all the old conscripts, the Shia, who were funded, the Mahdi army were all funded out of
Yes.
Iran, and everyone had AKs, and they buried 105s in the desert and had massive weapon caches. So the numbers of militia and heavily armed militia in Iraq, the Battle of Sada City, I was in the second Battle of Fallujah. You're talking 4,000 belt-fed PKMs, urban terrain, 24/7. No matter where you went, you're always in their backyard. Between the ID threat and even a rolling ambush, driving down Route Irish for between '04 and probably '07, '08. That little airport run between the green zone and the airport, that was the most dangerous road on earth, and it's like 4Ks. And if you Google,
Hmm.
Route Irish still today, so there's video of that of some both military and contractor ambushes on that you didn't get in Afghanistan. But again, that was a terrain war and a tribal war, which a lot of people, and I put this online um, on Twitter last night, that everyone's missing the key to Afghanistan is a lot of it is Hazaran versus Pashtun that goes back hundreds of years, but the cannibalizing terrain you got in Afghanistan, one road in, one road out. So you might drive in
Hmm.
to a village for a key leadership engagement or a sure or whatever, and they know you've got to come back out that, and they know you're going to come out early afternoon, so you're not trapped in there at night,
Yeah.
and they're just sitting up in the
Right.
hills waiting for you to come. Um,
Right.
so if you didn't get those, we were lucky. In some of our roles, we had good air assets, but if you were driving in, well, if you were coming out the same way you went in there, you were guaranteed that you were gonna it's going to get kinetic coming out. So we would do what's called a VDO, so vehicle drop off, and there were times we'd walk in 15 k's just so we had different points of egress and degress. But
Right.
the conventional guys really copped some batterings with that problem set in
Hmm.
Afghanistan.
That's interesting. I'm so glad you said that, because I think for the average person, let's face it, they couldn't find Afghanistan on a map. They don't know that. They don't know that the bad guys know exactly where you are. They know exactly that, as you said, the one road in, one road out. So it's almost like shooting fish in a barrel from their perspective. Shane, now that I assume you're no longer in the Australian military. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I discharged in 2016.
Okay. So you're obviously still involved in this space. We had a conversation before we started the podcast. Can you just tell my listeners sort of what are you focusing on now, and what is it you want people to know about counterterrorism from an Australian or from a Western perspective? What is it that occupies your mind these days?
So when I left, I got recruited into a counterviolent extremism team, and at that point, I had no real idea what counterviolent extremism was, and I was basically in the team with some psychologists and some social workers, and I was the ideological expert, having lived in the Middle East and had just recently returned from
Hmm.
12 months in Iraq, counter ISIS operations, and obviously that was a flavour of the month domestically too. Everyone was an ISIS fighter or supporter. So that was my role in the team initially, and was conducting I still do this now, conducting assessments and interviews. So I'd go into jails and conduct an interview with either a convicted terrorism related offender or an offender that potentially has been recruited inside a correctional facility or is coming up for parole or coming up for sentencing, and
Hmm.
conducting an interview about their ideology. And, do they believe in the ideology? Are they just saying it? Do they understand what they're saying? Is it just for show or is it for go? So I'll say I fell into it, but since I've got into it, and now have done, just about as many or if not more assessments in an Australian domestic context than anyone else in Australia. I firmly believe that 80% of what people refer to as counterterrorism is actually counterviolent extremism.
Right.
And
Right.
to me, as we were discussing earlier, counterterrorism is the kinetic part, all the way up
Hmm.
to a kinetic event. Now, sometimes it can come out of nowhere, and that could be, for example, in an Australian context, someone like ISIS Khan, who had a lot of mental health issues, supporter of
Hmm.
Islamic State, grabbed a knife and ran out of his house stabbing people. You're not going to have much
Right.
lead time in that to the Link Cafe siege, for example. Um,
Right.
they get hard point, Cetera Sydney type deal. But everything until that order's given for kinetic, or they decide to go kinetic, or they're going to conduct an attack, or you've got indicators and warnings as an analyst when you start briefing the boss.
Yes.
We're following
Yes.
this guy, or this guy's come up on our radar for he's trying to he's on jihadi websites, or he's trying to purchase a weapon. You still have the ability to do intervention. Now, whether that be um, discreet intervention or overt, going to his house and saying, "Hey, I'm with law enforcement. We've noticed this," or if they're a teenager or an adolescent, talking to their parents, talking to the community. It's all CVE, and there's too many people that honestly believe that's counterterrorism, and they're effectively conducting counterterrorism operations
Hmm.
in that space, if that makes sense.
No, no, it does make sense. Well, Shane, it certainly sounds like you've had quite the career from the time in the Australian military and as an independent contractor, and now working. I believe Peta Lowe was one of the people you're working with. Is that correct?
Yeah, she was my boss when I first started in the CVE team. Yeah, we still do some work together.
For my listeners who missed it, I had actually had a great conversation with Peta last year. I believe it was 2020. You can find it on the website. But I think there's so much more, Shane, that you can talk about in terms of what you saw, what you've learned. And I think the important part here is that irrespective of the knowledge you've gained after your career and during your career in terms of learning about ideologies and what they mean, a lot of the lessons that you have acquired are lessons that were acquired, as I like the term I like to use is at the coal face. You were there seeing this happen on the ground. It was developing. And I think you've given my listeners an awful lot to think about and a real appreciation for what, as you said, what true counterterrorism looks like when you're actually being asked to eliminate a real threat to human life, up to some of the stuff you're doing now in the CVE sphere. So I listen. I just want to take this time to thank you very, very much for joining me from just outside of Sydney. It's been a great podcast, and I got a sneaking suspicion I'm going to bring you back for a part two.
Excellent. Always available for a chat. Thank you.
So that was my conversation with Shane Healey, ex-Australian military, working some CVE now in Australia. What do you think about this distinction between CVE and CT? What about the role of the military in actually, let's face it, killing people if necessary? Love to hear your feedback. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @borealissaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like this content and want more, go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com. Hit the subscribe button. You get a free daily digest of all the podcasts and blogs. You'll also find a link to my latest book, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada, from Confederation to the Present. Counterterrorism as seen through the eyes of practitioners. I'd love to hear your feedback on this and other podcasts. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.